Right. I'm going to start with a photograph. This is anyone brought up within the Brethren will have seen this at one time or another. I think it's largely exclusive Brethren, and you'll see that they are a very bearded set of Victorian gentlemen there. But you possibly have noticed already that there's one younger person in that photograph, and there's also one, although exception to the aging white men in it, and there he's there. So this is my man, Christopher James Davis, right there in the center of these chief men among the Brethren, we might say. You can have great fun with this photograph. We did that before the rest of you joined, looking for Darby, looking for C.H. Mackintosh, William Kelly, and a number of others. You could argue, the photograph I think is interesting because you could argue that that's an aesthetic choice, that we had one person who was non-white, so to make him stand out or to range the rest around him, we'll put it in him in the middle as an aesthetic choice. Or you could argue that it's some sort of form of guilt, I suppose, that there are all these white aging men, so let's give the principal place to the one black individual there. But I like to think it's actually giving him pride of place, that the rest are in some ways giving way to this remarkable individual. Okay, so here he is. This is an etching that was done for a magazine article just after he died, in fact, a few months after he died. There was an etching that was appeared in the magazine. He's actually in his Aberdeen University graduation gowns in the etching. And of course, in reproduction in 1871, you couldn't reproduce photographs, so it was turned into an etching, and it's been widely reproduced. So my title is Le Bon Docteur Noir, C.J. Davis, 1840 to 1870. Christopher James Davis was born on the 22nd of April, 1840 in Whitehaven in St Philip Parish in Barbados, son of John Thomas Davis and Mary Ann Connell. According to the English missionary, Henry Bleby, who first encountered the family in Beulah Methodist Chapel in St Philip in early 1857, John Davis was a gentlemanly looking man and his wife a pleasant looking ladylike woman. Seemingly both parents had some European ancestry. To Bleby's experienced eye, John was nearly black and Mary was a quadroon, a quarter of African origin. In the parish of St Philip, located in the extreme southeast of the island, such mixed ancestry was not unusual, for it was something of a hinterland with infertile soils and a less rigid social structure, in which poor whites, free blacks, and coloureds intermingled and even had sexual relations, although, of course, European plantation owners, too, had unrestricted sexual access to their female slaves. Christopher was the youngest of 10 siblings, and, according to a not entirely reliable source, had the darkest skin of the family. John Davis gave his occupation as a carpenter at Christopher's baptism in the local Anglican Trinity Chapel. From the 1830s, the Methodists had been allowed to preach freely on the island, and by the time Bleby encountered the parents, they had been respectable members for a number of years. The Davises owned their house on a small piece of land, possessed a couple of cows, and supported themselves from the production of sugarcane and other crops. The family circumstances were modest, but possibly allowed for a degree of individual autonomy above the more usual condition of tenantry. Nevertheless, as Bleby's careful description of skin colour shows, it assigned them their place in a racially stratified society. Even he would not label Christopher black, but a Sambo, a much more racially offensive term nowadays, but in Bleby's usage, a nickname for someone with a parent possessing a considerable proportion of European blood. Being a respectable coloured young man would not save one of Christopher's brothers from being summarily incarcerated for a week for replacing his hat before exiting the office of a magistrate. Barbados had been a society based entirely in slavery, but in 1838, 2 years before Christopher's birth, full emancipation had been given to the enslaved. In some ways, life became harder as the white planter class made sure it continued to have access to cheap labour with unfavourable conditions for blacks and coloureds. One effect of emancipation had been to create a hunger among older Barbadians for education. When Christopher's parents had married in 1836, they had signed the register by making their mark, an indication of illiteracy. Bleby claimed in 1858 that Barbadians were as prepared as any people on earth to practice self-denial to obtain education for their children, being willing by all means to raise themselves. From an early age, Christopher had been enrolled in the local Methodist mission school. When he had first met Christopher in person in 1857, Bleby found Christopher had learned all his teacher was able to teach him. He recognised that he'd an uncommonly intelligent youth in front of him and took him in hand. Henry Bleby was typical of contemporary West Indian Methodism in having been an abolitionist and devoted to the evangelism of the Afro-Caribbean population, something which had been strong by the Anglican clergy and planters when Methodism first arrived in Barbados from the 1790s onwards. Bleby himself had been disfigured by hostile planters, violently assaulting him. On one occasion in Jamaica, where he had begun his missionary career in 1830, being tarred and feathered. He would publish several works sympathetic to rebellions among the Afro-Caribbean population and was strongly critical of the brutality and injustice of the British authorities. British Victorians to Barbados in this period were shocked at the state of individual morality. Bleby's account of his protege, written for a Methodist audience in Victorian Britain, sought to redress the balance. It demonstrated Bleby's own sense that, given the disadvantages with which the emancipated had started, their progress in civilization, intelligence, morals, and acquisition of property is quite up to, if not beyond, what could be reasonably expected. The essay he wrote in C.J. Davis, entitled "My Coloured Schoolmaster," is an exemplum of his thesis. In first talking to him, he'd found Christopher under serious religious impressions, being the subject of his parents' prayers. And soon after their meeting, Christopher began to meet in a Beulah Methodist class, joined the church, and became a Sunday school teacher. By the year's end, he'd experienced an evangelical conversion. Bleby saw Christopher as a potential Methodist minister. As he'd done with other promising lads, he sent him to neighbouring Antigua, to the Miko Training Institution, an English charitable foundation, which by 1858, when Christopher arrived at it, was training young men of the Negro and coloured races as teachers for Caribbean schools. Bleby provided Christopher with some necessary clothing, and the charity provided free board, books, and tuition. Bleby was not disappointed. For Christopher, he reported, outstripped all the other students in his attainments, and the principal asked him to stay on for a third year. On graduation, he was regarded as the most accomplished teacher the institution had trained. On his return to Barbados in the early 1860s, he was appointed the teacher at Dalkeith Wesleyan Primary School on the outskirts of Bridgeton, the island capital. Davis proved to be a fluent orator. Later in Britain, his mellifluous voice and commanding appearance would often be commented on. He became an exhorter in church, qualified to hold meetings, lead prayers, and evangelize, and then, eventually, a local preacher in the Methodist circuit, able to lead worship and preach regularly. His teaching career initially did not progress so smoothly. The temporary teacher he had succeeded lacked competence, and like many another new teacher, Davis was so discouraged that after 6 weeks, he wrote to Bleby asking for another position. Bleby encouraged him to persevere. By the end of his first term, school was full, and as a teacher, he became, according to Bleby, second to none in the island, attracting frequent approving visits from the British governor. Then in early 1866, C.J. Davis left Barbados for England with the intention of training as a doctor. Just before he was to be presented as a candidate for the Methodist ministry, he joined the Brethren. The Caribbean was an early area of overseas influence for the Brethren, being present from 1838 in British Guiana and by the early 1840s in Jamaica. They spread to Barbados in the early 1860s when Brethren missionaries from Blackheath in London, Benjamin Slim and his wife, who had commenced in Guyana in 1850, moved from Jamaica to the island, opening a small shop that sold basic foods and also religious literature. Around 1862, an assembly was founded in Bridgetown, and by 1870, the shop was being advertised as the Barbados Book and Gospel Tract Depot. The early 1860s were unsettled in Barbados. There was a severe drought, which led to famine and the spread of disease. In Davis's native St Philip, there were riots in 1863, suppressed by the cavalry. Agitation over lack of food became mingled with tensions over wages, which had been kept suppressed by the planter class. Emigration for more favourable conditions in other Caribbean islands rose markedly. When the Brethren homeopath, Dr. Thomas McCairn of Blackheath, visited Barbados in 1866, where he stayed with the Slims, he found an assembly of about 25 in Bridgetown, with another 6 or 7 looking to join. C.J. Davis was responsible for much of this growth, with 3 of his own family in St Philip leaving the Methodist Church to join the Brethren. He was preaching at various places in the island, outside church structures, but in houses and the open air, to large crowds, despite considerable opposition. Joining the Brethren had also meant he had to find a new profession, and he settled on studying medicine. In these unsettled social and personal conditions, he left Barbados with the intention of returning and working amongst his own people. So, Britain. It is a safe assumption that C.J. Davis's move to Britain was made through the Brethren network. The Slims had sided with the exclusives in the schism of 1848, as had Thomas McCairn. In London, Davis had not only come to the heart of empire, but to that of the Brethren too, where he would be welcomed into their close, intimate world. In early 1869, John Nelson Darby, the undisputed exclusive leader, visited Barbados, where he found an ear for his message. Davis was known to Darby, and Darby's Caribbean tour was possibly one result of their meeting, for it was the year after Davis arrived in London that Darby had been considering it. Darby, however, had long been in contact with Brethren missionaries in the Caribbean, and perhaps Thomas McCairn's reports were more influential as a spur for the visit. McCairn was not the only Brethren doctor practicing in London. The best known of those who knew Davis was McCairn's brother-in-law, Joseph Kidd, who was personal physician to Disraeli, and who, like McCairn, was a native of Limerick, an early Irish Brethren stronghold. Yet another Brethren physician who knew Davis was Arthur T. Schofield, who practiced in Harley Street. This circle of Brethren doctors were homeopaths, and so also was Davis, judging from him receiving an obituary in the British Journal of Homeopathy, which internal evidence suggests was written by one of the Brethren doctors. It was probably through the recommendation of one of them that Davis began his training in London at St Bartholomew's Hospital, nicknamed Bart's. In his first year in 1866, he won the Examiner's Prize in Practical Anatomy. His teacher at Bart's was the distinguished professor of anatomy and surgery, James Paget, later Sir James Paget, a devout High Anglican who was the first warden of the Medical College when it was established at Bart's in 1843. In 1869, he published the first study of medical education which might be regarded as using a modern methodology. Paget regarded Davis as one of the most able students that ever worked under him. In 1868, Davis passed the primary examination in anatomy and physiology at the Royal College of Surgeons. In addition to gaining certificates of merit in medicine and surgery, he also received one in midwifery. Despite University College London, with which St Bartholomew's was associated, being a secular university and therefore open to a dissenter such as Davis, it was to the University of Aberdeen, the northernmost of the 4 ancient universities of Scotland, that Davis went in 1869 to take his medical degrees. During the years at Barts, he stayed with the family of Henry Holland in Stoke Newington. The brethren were a tightly knit community and one which became increasingly aloof from those outside the sect. Holland, however, was a Congregationalist known for his charity. He was a wealthy silversmith whose business, which specialised in silver spoons, was expanding through acquisitions. The link to this somewhat surprising connection for a member of the exclusive brethren was probably St Bartholomew's. When appointed warden, Paget had reformed not only medical student education, but also behaviour. As a man of ascetic habits, he'd imposed discipline and order in their often chaotic conduct. It seems most probable that it was through this regime that a connection with Holland had been established to ensure Davis's security and supervision. Support for this can be seen in Holland's relationship to Davis, which was in loco parentis. The relationship between the two men was obvious to those who met Holland in Davis's presence, when in November 1870, Davis accompanied the Protestant pastor of Sedan, Charles Auguste Golden, on a visit to London. A brief biography of Davis, which appeared in the Religious Tract Society journal Sunday at Home, was probably written by the editor, the Scottish physician turned religious journalist, James Macaulay, who usually wrote anonymously. When Golden was his guest, he had Davis, joined by Holland and his family, for a meal at his house. He describes Davis as Holland's adopted son, towards whom Holland showed a parental care and liberality. While Davis regarded Holland as his father and Holland's daughters as his sisters. A month after Golden's visit, in a letter to Holland, Augustine Golden, the pastor's sister, uses the same language, calling Davis Holland's son, whom Holland had adopted. Holland was the person, her brother had said, who brought Davis out of himself. The use of liberality suggests Davis received financial assistance from Holland, but certainly as a stranger in English society, Davis was given by Holland a home, emotional support, and encouragement. Medical education in Aberdeen was in Marischal College, an impressive building in which Victorian Gothic triumphs over its obdurate granite. His studies continued to progress well. Aberdeen prided itself in its introduction of a modern medical syllabus, with teaching combining lectures with practical instruction, in the same combination of the theoretical and practical for class and degree examinations. At Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, Davis worked as a dresser and clerk, as well as being private assistant to the first Regius Professor of Surgery, William Pirrie, a devoted member of the Evangelical Free Church of Scotland and the author of a frequently reprinted textbook on surgery. On 4 occasions, Davis won prizes, including one in botany. During his finals, he was suffering from a dissection wound he'd received in London, which had caused severe inflammation of his chest skin. But he still did sufficiently well to win the 7 guinea prize in surgery. His graduation thesis was entitled "On the 2 diseases confounded under the name of syphilis." He probably had Barbados in mind with this topic, for recent research has shown that congenital syphilis may have been historically as high as 10% of the population in some areas of the island, responsible for increased levels of disease and infant mortality. Additionally, establishing the etiology and diagnosis of easily confused diseases would save some sufferers from the stigmatism of syphilis, a significant issue on Barbados, where being respectable could be hard won. Acceptance into middle-class British society had clearly not altered Davis's long-term objectives. In Aberdeen, he was known for his deep interest in the poor and indigent. At his graduation on the 20th of April, 1870, he became the university's first black graduate. He was then appointed as one of the 4 house physicians at St Bartholomew's. In 1861, Aberdeen was a city with a population of some 74,000, with its port having a growing export in meat, hides, and fish. There, Davis's life outside his professional education in Britain had become public. In his spare time, he'd begun street preaching. Using a table as a pulpit, he placed it on Sunday evenings at the junction of Union Street and Holborn Street two of the city's main thoroughfares. There's at least one other graduate of Aberdeen here, so those of us who know the place can see that spot well. He was a powerful preacher. According to the religious journalist Alexander Gamy, crowds numbering in the thousands would gather to listen to him, with some sitting at house windows. For the preceding decade, Aberdeen had been a centre for revivalism, and Davis's earnest evangelistic preaching would have been familiar in the city. Probably for many, curiosity was the attraction. One Aberdeen tailor who was converted through his preaching had crossed the street to hear him simply because coloured people were a rarity so far north. Davis rented the ballroom of the music hall, an imposing neoclassical building that seated some 2,000, which he more than filled, with Professor Pirrie among his hearers. A Brethren assembly had already existed in Aberdeen since 1866, and under Davis's efforts, it grew markedly. He also visited Foot Dee, locally called Fitty, the fishing village at the mouth of the River Dee, where he had an enthusiastic reception, with people asking him to preach to them, and also for a return visit. His influence spread outside the city, visiting Glasgow, evidently on a number of occasions. Several times in the spring of 1870, he visited Montrose, just down the coast from Aberdeen, where he held evangelistic meetings in various places in the town. It was probably through a visit to New Deer, some 30 miles northeast of Aberdeen, that the farmer John Davidson was influenced by him to become brethren and form an assembly. And those of you who know your brethren history will know that John Davidson was the grandfather of F.F. Bruce's wife. The places he visited in Scotland had been centres for revivalism over the previous decade, although in Glasgow and Montrose, brethren were also to be found. In England too, he preached in several places where he was sometimes advertised as from Barbados. As in Aberdeen, true to the entrepreneurial spirit of contemporary revivalism, the organisers of his meetings knew curiosity could attract a crowd. His preaching in Aberdeen received opposition from other churches. On Sunday evenings, rival open-air preaching was held outside the Free Church College, which was close to his stance at the Union Street, Holborn Street junction. The same happened in Foot Dee, where his listeners were also warned off listening to him. On both occasions, Davis withdrew from the competition. This opposition had nothing to do with race, but everything to do with contemporary suspicion of the brethren. In Scotland, they'd only begun appearing in numbers within the decade, and their anti-clericalism and distinctive teachings were still suspect. We had heard of brethren, but only as bad people, noted the Northeast missioner, who erected a hall in Foot Dee in 1869, and that man was Donald Ross, later to become very prominent in the brethren. One prominent Presbyterian elder in Aberdeen published an anonymous denunciation of Davis's views entitled "A Few Counsels Regarding Some Prevalent Errors," 1869. Davis's reply came in a series of lectures on the 6 issues on which the elder had criticised them, such as the church, the Sabbath, and the place of Old Testament law in Christianity. Finding his time limited, he had the lectures taken down in shorthand and issued in what was probably his first publication. The elder then replied with "Prevalent Errors," a reply to a lecture by Mr. C.J. Davis. Davis again answered with an expanded pamphlet, now entitled "Help for Inquirers," in 1870. This was the stuff of 19th century religious pamphlet wars, although Davis was always careful to remain in the side of Christian courtesy, calling the elder "my brother." Having begun as an author, after graduation, Davis also prepared for publishing some more extended Aberdeen lectures that are principally addressed to assembly members, perhaps his converts, explaining the basis of brethren ecclesiology. They appeared as Aids to Believers in 1871, which even in print preserve his rhythmical cadences. In the event, they would appear posthumously, as did Grace and Truth, also in 1871. A collection of his evangelistic tracts. These lectures and tracts show little of his Barbadian background. The tracts are in the homely style favoured by Victorian gospel pamphleteers. They declare the revivalist message of salvation through the penal substitution of Christ distinctive only in a Scottish context in promoting instant conversion and propositional assurance, doctrines which the Brethren shared with mid-Victorian revivalism. In one tract, he compares redemption to a man about to be hanged as his wife and broken children stand by when a horseman gallops up with a reprieve issued by the colonial governor, commuting the sentence. Another illustration seems suggested more by the unsettled society of Barbados in the early 1860s than contemporary Aberdeen. In explaining the Brethren concept of the Second Advent, having a separate initial rapture for believers, followed by a time of suffering for the left behind, he imagines the citizens of Aberdeen rising up against Queen Victoria, living at Balmoral. The Queen approaches to shell the city, but remains faithful to her promise to first meet those remaining loyal to her at Bankery, the town nearest her castle. That's why the rapture happens in Bankery. This premillennialist eschatology of the Brethren, with its personal return of Christ, was a leading theme in his preaching. At Foot D, it was a topic in which he was questioned, and it also features prominently in his evangelistic tracts. In Aids to Believers, it is the subject of the first lecture. It was one of the central attractions that Brethren doctrine had for him. The increased supernaturalism implicit in it is also evident in other lectures through the prominence given to typically Brethren themes, which downgraded the merely human at the expense of the divine. Sunday was not for sermonizing, but for the Lord's Supper and communion with both Christ and each other. The church was not an organization, but the organic one body gathered to the name of Christ. And Christian ministry was a gift of the Spirit, with Christ alone preparing and ordaining to it. Davis had evidently used his 3 years in England well by immersing himself in Brethren literature. Among the works he cites is William Kelly's recent lectures in the Book of Revelation, just published in 1869, but he also quotes other earlier leading Brethren writers, Darby, C.H. Mackintosh, and F.G. Patterson. These are quoted in the controversial Help for Inquirers to educate the Aberdeen elder from original sources in explanations of Brethren beliefs, as he appears to have been unaware of precisely what Brethren taught. Davis was also able to point out to the elder that one writer of widely read evangelistic tracts, Charles Stanley, who published as C.S., was Brethren. Otherwise, in Aids to Believers, his consistent practice is to follow the primitivist Brethren maxim to search the scriptures, which they did using a literalistic hermeneutic. As B.M. Peach has argued, the Brethren imbibed, through their conversational Bible readings that were a staple, a methodology that trusted in the perspicuity of Scripture, which, by accumulating extensive knowledge of the biblical text, turned the ordinary Christian reader into an expert interpreter. This intensive study and classification of Scripture appealed to thinkers inclined to the categorization of knowledge, grounding a religion of the heart in the intellectual validity to which modern science appealed. Davis's lectures demonstrate an ordered mind, able to express itself in cogently methodical prose, in tune with the contemporary cultural mood for the transcendent. The Lord himself will soon descend from heaven, he concludes the lectures, but while he leaves us here, he graciously provides for our spiritual growth, and he strengthens us to be his living witnesses, each in our own sphere. This was not a position of invulnerability. The state should not send its military or navy to defend missionaries, he argued, for Christians were not rulers of the world, but sufferers in it. And so to France. Having taken up his post at St Bartholomew's in April, he resigned it in September. On 16th July, France had declared war in Prussia after a period of mounting tension between the two powers. The war decisively shifted the balance of power in Europe and led to the creation of a united Germany. France long had been dominant in the European continent, but without allies, the country had unknowingly blundered into war with a rising force that possessed a military machine more efficient and powerful. The war went badly for France. The breech-loading rifle of the Prussian army proved a reliable and deadly new weapon, while increased artillery accuracy and power meant both sides sustained considerable losses. As news of the scale of death and casualties reached the British press, as elsewhere in Europe, it created a sense of horror, which generated an outpouring of aid. In early August, a public meeting was held in London, at which a national society for aiding the sick and wounded in war was established, a precursor to the British Red Cross. Among the first medical volunteers to respond was a group of Bart's men, medical veterans of the American Civil War. Davis was also moved to action. The trigger for his volunteering was possibly the Battle of Sedan in the Ardennes and the French-Belgian border on 1st and 2nd September. The battle had been a crushing defeat for France, leaving 3,000 French dead and a further 14,000 wounded. Compared to Prussia, this was a casualty rate of 4 to 1, but its army also had some 9,000 dead, wounded, and missing. It was for Sedan that Davis set out, entering France from the north via Belgium to avoid the retreating French army as the Prussians advanced towards Paris. He decided to volunteer independent of any organization to give him freedom of movement to go where the need was greatest. But he was also aware that some within the Exclusive Brethren were not happy with an association with secular societies. He had made close friends in the Brethren in Rotherham in the West Riding of Yorkshire, where Charles Stanley, the tract writer and evangelist, was a member. Davis had forged particularly close links with a brass manufacturer, Richard Crimes, who made his fortune by his invention of a screw that produced the first leak-proof water tap. The language of adoption was also used of the Crimes. In France, Davis called Mary Crimes ma chère sœur adoptive, my dear adopted sister. It was to Crimes he turned initially to finance his expedition, which he intended to be as much evangelistic as medical. It was undoubtedly Crimes who placed £1,000 at his disposal. He also acted as a clearinghouse for later contributions, and other brethren helped, such as Joseph Kidd, Charles Stanley, and the Irish landowner, Sir Edward Denny. Despite not being associated with any of the British societies, Davis realised the need for official approval, not to be suspected as a spy. First, he acquired letters of introduction from the British National Society, and in Brussels, he attained accreditation from the Geneva Society, allowing him to use for safe passage its armband with its distinctive red cross, eventually adopting as its name. While there, he also purchased tobacco, cigars, wine, and beef. In the final leg of his journey into France, he was deeply moved as he walked through the French wounded and dying, and he scattered cigars as he went. The casualties were being cared for in ambulances, a term which had a broader meaning than our contemporary usage, as it encompassed a variety of different types of units. A closer approximation is the modern field hospital, although rather than using tents, existing buildings were repurposed. In Sedan, Davis obtained permission from the mayor, Adolphe Roney, to join any ambulance he wished. In the company of his dresser from St Bart's, he embarked on a tour of the ones in the vicinity, where he met Thomas Trench, a fellow Brethren member who was acting as a supplier to one of the ambulances. Davis was shocked by what he found. The Prussian military doctors had advanced with the troops into France, leaving the wounded untended. Men were lying in fetid conditions amid purulent discharge from wounds and decomposing excrement. The following day, Davis and Trench did a brief tour of the battlefield and surveyed the ruins of Bassailles, formerly a village to the southeast of Sedan, with a population of 2,300, but now with one solitary house standing. The village had borne the brunt of the opening attack of the battle by the Bavarian Corps, which was fighting with the Prussians. A few kilometres south of Sedan, Davis and Trench reached Pont Maugis, part of the commune of Noyer. Here he discovered some 530 Bavarian casualties in the ambulance, with typhus and typhoid rife, causing dysentery and diarrhea. The Bavarian medical officer was about to leave and food was scarce. Davis was pressed to take charge of the ambulance, which was in a spinning factory scattered over 7 different buildings, with the men lining the floor, some dead and others dying from fever. After he and Trench had prayed, He took responsibility for what he thought would be about a month, with Trench acting as deputy for supplies. There had been no one else to help with either food or medical aid. Davis had the experience of dysentery at Bart's, and so he sent to work, first by smashing windows in the factory roof to allow fresh air to circulate. His new patients were not in need of surgery, he realised, but nursing care with good food and beds. 2 visiting English nurses found him busy supervising the German orderlies and banishing any green fruit. He organised carpenters to create pallets for beds that would raise the patients above floor level and ordered up hay for them to lie on. Over the next 3 weeks, the number of deaths dropped steadily, from 18 per week to 11, and most of the last were men who'd already been ill from dysentery for over a month. Practical Christianity is now needed, he noted in a letter to Richard Crimes. His view of the war echoed the standard evangelical response, that it was a judgment of God. In Davis's eyes, one nation was not to blame for its consequences more than another, but it was Franco-Prussian butchery. As the health of the Bavarians improved enough to enable them to leave, Davis turned his attention to the some 2,000 to 3,000 poor French citizens in the immediate area, with another 6,000 on the other side of the River Meuse, none of whom had been in paid work since August, the weavers' looms having been destroyed. By the later 19th century, in times of famine and war, soup kitchens were of established value, and Davis opened 2, capable between them of serving 1,000 people. He also instituted a system of house visitation, distributing bread and medical aid, all the doctors having moved on with the ambulances. Money was a constant need. Staff had to be paid, and when funds ran out for his soup kitchens, rather than see any without food, he offered to sell his own watch, a significant contemporary status symbol that he had won as a student. His peals and letters home were made widespread. Those to Richard Crimes were lithographed and distributed, which led 2 brethren women, Mrs. Cruikshank and Miss Learmouth, joining him as nurses. His letters were also published in the Daily News, a newspaper that trebled its circulation during the war, and then reprinted in newspapers in Barbados, where the Anglican rector of St James, P. Bruce Austin, offered to forward donations to Davis. By early November, Davis had spent the initial £1,000, the equivalent of $94,000 in 2023, and he calculated he needed another 1,500. He now also hoped to open a 50-bed hospital for the poor. It was partly with fundraising in mind. He took advantage of a quiet spell to return to London early November in the company of Charles Golden. The 2 men spoke at a meeting in St Augustine's, the newly erected Church of England building in Highbury, after which a collection was taken, and a local committee in which Henry Holland sat was established to collect subscriptions for the relief fund for poor civilians. On Thursday, 10th November, Davis left London for Belgium, intending to concentrate his efforts on the impoverished and starving citizens in the neighbourhood of Sedan. By the following Sunday, he was unwell, and after 2 days in bed on the Wednesday, the first macules of smallpox showed themselves. It was at this point the doctor who examined him was alarmed to find he had not been vaccinated. According to the medical journal, The Lancet, Davis had entertained a strong prejudice against the system, which he'd expressed on more than one occasion. In Britain, compulsory vaccination for children had been introduced in 1853, although it was not until the late 1860s anti-vaccinators in Victorian Britain had emerged in strength, with medical men among them, pleading for freedom against smallpox vaccination, which was by then being more rigidly enforced. As Nadia Durbach has shown, anti-vaccinators thought it unnecessary, but advocated alternative remedies, such as keeping the body clean, eating good food, and taking plenty of fresh air. It was probably partly because of this that at Port Mangy, Davis had put such a regime into practice and found it effective against fevers. Anti-vaccination, according to Durbach, had wedded itself to alternative medicine and to a culture of dissent that expressed anxieties over exploitation, and it was particularly strong among nonconformists. It meshed with their distrust of the marriage between church and state in the establishment. Mandatory vaccination seemed akin to compulsory baptism. Davis's colonial background possibly made him suspicious of compulsion by the authorities. With a circle of brethren medical men Davis had joined in London, who were advocates of the alternative practice of homeopathy, and the attraction that brethren ecclesial autonomy had for him, were undoubtedly more significant for his attitude. One brethren doctor, born in the decade after Davis, who became famous in England for his advocacy of anti-vaccination, was Walter Hadwin of Gloucester. And Hadwin also maintained the other associated dissenting cause of anti-vivisection. Smallpox was certainly present in the war zone. Most German soldiers had been vaccinated, leading to only 483 cases during the whole war, whereas among the French, there were 4,178 cases. It was present in London too. In late December, there was a smallpox outbreak at Barts. One of the first victims was a ward sister who died 3 days after shaking hands with Davis, the day before he returned to France. And therefore, if anything, would have been more likely to have infected Davis rather than the other way around. On his return to Sedan, Davis had visited the military hospital where there were smallpox cases. But given the timescale, it is much more likely Davis had already been incubating the disease while in England in early November. Symptoms begin 12 days after infection, with the pustules appearing after some 20 days. Davis, in his overworked state, was considerably more susceptible to infection and tired after traveling, more likely to suffer serious consequences than would have been the case if he had been rested and fit. On his initial journey into France, as he witnessed the ambulances for the first time, he'd felt deeply grateful to him who protects the very sparrows, and much more his saints. The two witnesses to his final days and hours, Augustine Golden and Mary Crimes, presented his faith as a model Christian death. If Augustine Golden, who nursed him, asked him if he were uncomfortable, he would reply, "Non, j'aime Dieu, j'aime Dieu." When his health worsened, the Crimes were sent for. They arrived 12 hours before Davis died on Sunday, 27th November. After reassuring Mary Crimes that his trust in God was unabated, his last words to her, ones deeply symbolic for the Christian reader, were, "And now I'm going to sleep." It was a strongly pro-vaccination Lancet that gave a bluntly medical account of his deathbed conversations by stating he had regretted his decision not to be vaccinated, although this was possibly wishful thinking on its part. Some 2,000 came to his funeral, among them the poor, many in their best clothes, with others in rags. It was conducted by 3 Protestant clergymen, Golden being joined by English and German ones. The German commandant allowed the city gate leading to the burial ground to be opened, although he had not done this for his own officers, and the mayor gave an address at the graveside. In his native Caribbean, newspapers reported Davis's death, while in Britain, where his fame had grown due to his letters, many national newspapers did the same, as did many regional ones, from Essex to Aberdeen. It was one of the last, the Aberdeen Free Press, that provided his most apt epitaph. Dr. Davis was a blithe, handsome-looking man with exceedingly frank and affable manners. So, legacy. In his graveside address, incidentally, blithe would be a word that is still currently in use in Scotland, and blithe would have been a word current in northeastern Scots. In his graveside address, the mayor of Sedan repeated the local moniker for C.J. Davis, le bon docteur noir. Almost immediately, he was der gute schwarze Doctor and the good black doctor. Doubtless the original epithet was meant affectionately, but all his life, he was singled out by his skin colour. In European society, like other contemporary black evangelicals, he was always an exotic outsider. It was his friend, the homeopathic Dr. A.T. Schofield, who gave the English epithet permanence in a children's book, which was also published as an evangelistic tract entitled The Good Black Doctor. In it, Schofield claimed that Davis was unduly sensitive on the point of colour, Schofield retells the contents of a letter that David had sent him on his last visit to England, recounting a conversation in a rail compartment when David was returning from what must have been his last visit to the crimes in Yorkshire. He was wearing a stylish smoking cap and, tired with the journey, leant back and closed his eyes. One woman passenger, after declaring how handsome he was, justified her outspokenness to her husband by stating Davis could not possibly understand English, for he must be an African prince visiting Queen Victoria. Being as black as coal, he was clearly a heathen who did not even know he had a soul. Davis had let the woman run on for a while until surprising her with his pure English. He proceeded to explain the evangelical gospel to her and display an intimate knowledge of the Bible vastly superior to that of others in the compartment. In France, Augustine Golden used the tropes of light and darkness to comment on his consummate bedside manner. She said to her sister, "See, this man, instead of looking dark, is like a sun to his sick. Look how they all brighten as he speaks to them." Opinion among the Germans also echoed the contrast between racial stereotype and warm humanity. In 1871, one German visitor to Sedan from the Evangelical Lutheran Church was told, and here I'm indebted to Michael Schneider for translation from the German, he was a real Negro. The full type of African was pronounced in him, but his face had a beautiful, ideal feature. A glow of bright enthusiasm was always spread over his face. To win acceptance, as he did in Britain and France, Davis had to show superior qualities and performance. It's difficult to know how to interpret the metaphor adoption that was used of him. Is it condescending paternalism or Christian kindness to a stranger in a strange land, or both? Similarly difficult to read is Schofield's comment that about colour he was unduly sensitive. Is this an example of unconscious racism that is blind to the discrimination that Black people suffered in Victorian Britain? Or is it a mark of Schofield's evangelical belief in the universalism of human nature, that he felt there was no need for Davis to be upset? Or both? Evangelicalism had been an enabling force in Davis's life, as John Hargreaves, who was a history prof at Aberdeen, noted of Davis's time in Aberdeen. His church affiliations offered friendship and integration that mitigated the loneliness and lack of understanding that afflicted the few overseas students in Britain in this period. More than that, they had taken him from Barbados to European fame. Within the Brethren, J.N. Darby set the tone for his acceptance. Davis had arrived in Britain at what seems to be a turning point for the exclusive Brethren, with some within them moving from the broader connections with a humanitarian evangelicalism that allowed someone like Davis to forge links outside the movement in church and society. Darby was a supporter of Davis's medical and evangelistic mission to France, for like some other brethren, he was greatly alarmed the effects the war had on brethren in France and Germany. When he overheard some of the more narrow-minded who were in favour of a more introverted bretherism, speculating that Davis's death was in fact a judgment of God for engaging in worldly philanthropy, Darby had silenced them all by saying, well, God has accepted his service and taken him home. Excuse me. Davis's exceptionalism was celebrated in an initial flurry. I've spent 2 months researching this, and I got rather involved with C.J. Davis. He begins to seem like a friend. Davis's exception was celebrated in an initial flurry of evangelical magazine articles after his death. He was also included in some German histories published in the aftermath of the war, and also in at least one English and one French one. It was a mark of his exceptionalism that he was never entirely forgotten. The Harlem Renaissance search for in the Harlem Renaissance search for Black role models, Eric Walrond published a profile of him, claiming such people as Davis raise the common level of our common nature and bring it nearer to the lights of heaven. In contrast to Walrond's rather free improvisation on Davis's life, in 1956, the local history journal in Sedan carried a meticulously researched article based on local archives. The late 20th century interest in Black history has led to him being rediscovered for Black Americans in Britain, Aberdeen University, and Black evangelicals. He had never been quite forgotten within the Brethren. As an evangelical and Brethren member, his life had been exemplary. In 1912, his Aids for Believers had run through by 1912, his Aids for Believers had run through 18 editions. For Davis had provided the Brethren with the best introductory handbook of their own distinguishing doctrines. In 1999, Edwin Cross, an exclusive Brethren bookseller, published a brief biographical account of him, which later became the basis of the Wikipedia entry in Davis. And it has been the World Wide Web in which he's received the most widespread publicity, with Barbados, Aberdeen University and its medical school, and a French academic institute all having web pages on him, with his theological writings also available on websites maintained by Brethren. If anything is elided in 20th century accounts, it is the centrality that evangelical Christianity had for him as an enabling and motivating force. Recent websites and publications are part of the concern to recover forgotten Black history. With this reassessment, it is still possible to celebrate him as le bon docteur noir. And I want to finish by with another photograph. Look at that for a little while. I think you can see so many of the characteristics that came through in the paper there in that photograph.